A sharp winter wind cut across New York as snow quietly covered the sidewalks. At a nearly empty bus stop under a flickering street lamp, Henry stood hunched in a thin, worn olive jacket, clutching a manila folder that held 5 carefully written RA summaries. Each one another quiet refusal. He was 46, once a structural engineer, a widower, and for now, living out of an old pickup truck. The cold had soaked into his boots and into his bones, but what weighed heaviest was the sense that the world had somehow moved on without him. A woman appeared through the falling snow. She was in her early 30s, dressed in a business skirt and blouse, heels tapping on the pavement, but no coat to protect her from the night. Her wet hair clung to her face. She hugged her arms around herself and rubbed her hands, trying to chase the chill. Henry watched without meaning to. She had a presence, polished and quiet, but clearly freezing. When the wind gusted, she flinched. Henry didn't think about it for long. He shrugged off his jacket and held it out to her. She started, saying she didn't have to accept it. He gave a tired smile and said simply that he'd lost enough already. She needed it more than he did. She wrapped the jacket around her shoulders, surprised by the warmth. It smelled faintly of soap and coffee. She thanked him and climbed onto the bus, glancing back once before disappearing into the snowy night. Henry slipped the business card. She handed him into his folder, assuming it would likely never be used. Back in his truck behind a warehouse, Henry opened a small tin and took out a faded photo of his wife Lily and their son Noah, 7 in the picture with a crooked grin. He whispered goodnight to both before settling into the blankets. Before Lily's cancer, Henry had built schools, homes, hospitals. After she died 9 months into the illness, his life fell apart. He'd given up work to care for her, then lost savings and, eventually, their home. For a time he kept things together for Noah, turning the back seat into a spaceship, making dinner into small adventures. Until a social worker said Noah needed stability, and heartbroken, Henry signed the papers that put his son somewhere safer. He promised, "Just for now, I'll come back for you." Since then, every day had been a quiet climb to find that promise again. Claire Langston didn't intend to carry the coat home. But in the jacket's inner pocket, she found something unexpected, a child's crayon drawing. 2 stick figures stood under a crooked sun, one labeled Dad, the other or me, and at the bottom, in uneven letters, "I love you, Daddy, Noah." The drawing stopped her. It wasn't just a scrap of paper. It was a life held close. Claire felt something break open inside her, a memory she hadn't let surface in years. A girl, sitting cold outside a church long ago, someone noticing her, handing her a coat and staying. That small kindness years ago had changed everything for Claire. It had set her on the path out of foster care and eventually to found Infinity Group, the tech company she'd built from a single idea. Now a stranger's coat had cracked her armor and made her cry. The next morning, with the crumpled drawing in her hand, Claire called her assistant Rachel. She asked Rachel to find Henry quietly. The team moved efficiently. Traffic camera footage, bus route logs, cross-references with public records. They unspooled a life from traces. Henry Miles, a structural engineer whose licenses had expired, no recent employment, a prepaid phone number, a photo from a long-ago driver's license. A tip placed him near the South Bronx, the old pickup truck behind a warehouse. Claire decided to see him herself. When she arrived at the truck, Henry opened the door slowly, blinking in the daylight. He was cautious, embarrassed, the kind of man who carried too much dignity for the clothes he wore. Claire told him she couldn't stop thinking about what he'd done, about the courage that took. He laughed, a little bitter. saying she didn't need to hunt him down just to say thanks. She shook her head. It wasn't about thanks. It was about keeping something good from disappearing unnoticed. Soon Henry found himself driving with Claire and stopping at a construction site in Queens, where he'd been working. She had already told the foreman he had an interview, and then explained to Henry that she had something else in mind. She drove him back into the city and up into the glass, walled world he'd always thought he didn't belong in. He hesitated in Infinity Group's marble lobby, feeling entirely out of place. Claire led him into a small conference room and slid a folder across the table. Inside was an offer he didn't expect, a role she had created, cultural and human values advisor. Not a title meant to impress investors, but a seat at conversations about how people were treated, how teams were built, about reminding the company to look beyond metrics and remember humans. Claire explained that Henry's life, the fact that he knew what it felt like to be invisible and still chose kindness, mattered more than any credential. He could teach people something a degree couldn't, how to care. Henry's first reaction was disbelief. He slept in a truck. He didn't belong in a boardroom. Claire was not offering charity, she said. She was offering perspective. She wanted him to remind her company, and her, what kindness looked like in action. He left the building with the folder in his lap, but didn't open it. Old mistrust whispered that offers like this were traps. The next thing he knew, she was beside him again, asking him to come with her for an hour. No suits, no meetings. She took him to a modest red brick community center called Thomas's Place, a bright, noisy space full of children, handprints on the walls and the smell of crayons. Claire told him the center was named for the man who had once wrapped a coat around her shoulders on a freezing night. He didn't ask anything, she said. He just stayed. She'd built the center because that moment had told her she mattered. And last week, someone else had given her a coat. Henry listened in silence as children laughed and volunteers tidied toys. In that room, among the ordinary warmth of people helping people, he stopped seeing his own life as a list of losses. He saw how a single small act could reshape someone else's path. He didn't take the job out of pride or charity. He took it because for the first time in a long while he felt needed. He started sharing his story the way he always had, small pieces of it, honestly, without dramatics. He spoke of loss and of the tiny choices that keep a life moving forward. He asked simple questions that made people pause. When was the last time you learned the janitor's name? What would you do if someone cried in the break room? He didn't hand out solutions. He invited people to notice one another. Slowly, the change rippled through the office. Interns sought him out. Burning members of the team found a quiet space to talk. Lines of division blurred as human stories replaced company slogans. Outside of work, the company's small housing stipend and Claire's support helped Henry put a down payment on a modest one-bedroom house in Brooklyn. It had a porch and a tiny garden, and most important, it could hold a family again. No returned, now a student at the local university, and their first dinner back together, spaghetti and garlic bread, felt like a miracle. No said simply, "You kept your promise," and Henry, with a knot in his throat, felt he had. Claire and Henry's relationship grew the way real ones do, through shared time and quiet moments rather than grand declarations. Work meetings became lunches, then coffees, then slow evening walks. They were careful at first, both battered by different kinds of losses, both carrying forms of armor that slowly softened. Henry brought with him a way of seeing people that kept the company from forgetting its heart. Claire brought resources and a desire to reconnect with the part of herself shaped by old kindness. One day, Infinity Group hosted One Kindness Day. The atrium was transformed, banners replaced with soft drapes and warm lights, and at the center a framed display held the old, worn coat Henry had given Claire. Claire told the story from the stage, how a single act on a bitter night had rewritten her life and inspired the creation of Thomas's place. When she asked Henry to join her, the crowd rose. To his surprise, he stood and walked up, and Claire handed him an envelope containing the deed to the house. "No more sleeping in trucks," she said. Gasps filled the room. Henry, who had kept a small box in his pocket for years, took it out then. Inside was a simple silver ring. "You said that coat changed your life," he told her, voice trembling. "You changed mine." He asked Claire to marry him. She laughed through tears and said yes. They married a month later at Thomas's place. It wasn't formal or expensive. Children made paper flowers. The cake came from an intern. The chairs didn't all match. It was, by every measure that mattered, perfect. No stood beside his father as best man. Volunteers, co-workers, neighbors, people whose lives had been touched by Henry's quiet work filled the room. The coat, now in a glass frame beside them, became a symbol, proof that small, unassuming acts sometimes carry the power to change everything. After the wedding, life continued in its quiet, faithful way. Henry's workshops and conversations lingered in the halls of Infinity Group. Employees began to check in on each other, not because a mandate told them to, but because they'd learned to look. Henry would listen to a young developer who felt on the edge, and sometimes the developer would leave saying the single thing he needed to hear had been said. Those moments added up. In a small office with mismatched chairs, Henry found his place. In a modest house with a garden, he and Noah rebuilt the rituals of family. And Claire, who had once thought success meant climbing higher, learned again what it meant to be seen and to give. Their story spread online. A photograph of the couple beside the framed coat moved through feeds and inboxes, a reminder that kindness is never wasted. Henry didn't become famous. He didn't need fanfare. He simply kept doing what he'd always done. Showing up, listening, offering what he could. The coat that once kept a stranger from freezing had, in time, held together a family, inspired a community center, and changed a company's heart. If there's a lesson here, it's plain compassion doesn't require perfection or theater. It only asks that we be present. Sometimes the smallest things, a coat, a moment of attention, a few honest words, have the power to rewrite a life.